2011, and it's about 2:15 in the afternoon. We're sitting in the Selma Burke Room of the Mooresville Public Library with two Mooresville-born gentlemen, William McCrae Howard and Marshall Howard. Both of these gentlemen grew up in Mooresville and have a lot of the early history in their heads, and we're going to try to extract some of it from today. So, Marshall, why don't you lead things off and tell us about early Mooresville?
Well, Mooresville's changed a lot in the last 50 plus years. One of the things that's a whole lot different is grocery stores. Grocery stores back when I was young were privately owned, all except one. It was Piggly Wiggly. And the different owners were Johnson's, McNeely's, Shimpox, Smith's, Neal's, and you had some others that was, who had?
Seth Gable.
Yeah, Seth Gable. Seth Gable's the one. And back then, if you wanted some groceries, you just picked up the phone and ordered. You wanted a pound of peas, and it got any nice tomatoes today, and it was delivered to your door. And once a week, you went down and paid your bill. And the Piggly Wiggly store was owned by Mr. Millsap, and that was Ralph and Harvey and Clyde, father, and he and some other people founded the Deluxe Ice Cream Company. He ran the inside of it, and Mr. Carr run the outside. He had the truck, and he did the delivery work. And Mr. Carr also trained wild horses, and he'd bring them in from the west and break them in the barnyard. And I decided one day I could ride those horses like that, and so the horse bucked, and finally they opened the gate and let it run, and it run down across the pasture and got to the far end and turned around, and I kept going. That's the last time I rode a bronc, and that's the Millsaps continued to own Deluxe until not very long ago, and they sold it to a fellow up in Statesville that has a dairy. So that was a good match. Cow milk to ice cream. Another thing I thought about was the early days. Very, very few people had electric refrigerators. Most people had ice boxes, and Mr. Johnson had a wagon that went around several times a week delivering ice. And if you wanted ice, you put a card in the window that had 25, 50, 75, and 100, and you turned it up according to how many pounds you wanted. And the man come down the road with his horse-drawn wagon and yelling, "Ice man!" and he'd saw off whatever you wanted and take it and put it in your ice box. And the first electric refrigerator I ever saw belonged to Stevens' family. George Stevens, still living, and it had a coil up on top. I think it was a GE, but that was we didn't have an electric refrigerator till several years after that. The early days, the turn of the century, cotton was a big product in this area, and my grandfather bought 113 acres of land and planted cotton and paid for it in 1 year with the cotton crop. And he built a log cabin out there, and then later a house, and the house is still standing. The cabin, it wasn't really a little cabin. It was, as I remember, it was a 2-story large, but it was made out of logs. And the Mooresville had Mooresville Laundry, and on North Main Street, the Sink brothers owned it. And here again, a big difference in anything today. If you wanted your laundry done, and very few people had washing machines, you tied it up in the sheet and all four corners and put it out on the porch, and they picked it up, took it and laundered it, and folded it real nice and delivered it back to you. And they also was dry cleaners in Mooresville, Brannan's, of which one of the Brannan's still is in business, and it was Cherry's and Hobbs, Logan Hobbs, but Brannan's the only one that the family member still owns. The other two's long gone. And Logan Hobbs, I think, was the first job I ever had, was working with him a little bit in the summertime. The schools in Mooresville, there was 3 schools, high school and Parkview and South School and high school, and also Dunbar. Dunbar was the school for black children, and the man that was the principal of the black school that got Dunbar, that when they consolidated the schools and desegregated, they found out he was the most highly educated, and they offered him the position of any school that he wanted, and he stayed in what was Dunbar. But we never had any racial problems in Mooresville like they had in Statesville, primarily because of him and his wife and the way they had treated black people in Mooresville. It was a whole lot different world back then. People took care of their children, and they fed them, and when they went to school, there was no cafeterias. We had an hour for lunch. People that lived in town went home for lunch. My dad would pick us up at Parkview and take us home for lunch and bring us back. And the very few that was, when they closed all the country schools, I think there was 3 buses that came into Mooresville, and those children brought their lunch with them. But there was no cafeterias. Cafeterias came along when the government had a whole lot of surplus food after World War II and wanted to give it away, so the schools started cafeterias that was all volunteers. I don't think they had a paid person in the cafeterias originally, and then it expanded from that to what it is today. But back then, parents were responsible for feeding their children. The state and the county and the schools didn't have any responsibility. Our school teachers and principals were the best they could possibly be. Most of them were single, had never married. Miss McNeely, Mary McNeely, I think, and Schoaf and Hattie Williams were all never married, and yet they kept touch with a lot of their students, and they didn't have any children of their own, and yet they had lots of children. The principals of the school didn't have any assistants. They taught classes, and they didn't have all that paperwork they've got today. And so the principals, they didn't spend a lot of time promoting themselves and their jobs like some of the educators have to do today. They didn't have to. We just had the best possible school teachers and principals in Mooresville at the time. Gasoline, when I was young, cost 25 cents a gallon. I could fill up my A-model Ford for about $1 and drive it all day. And there was no tax on it. They didn't tax it at the well, they didn't tax the transportation, they didn't tax it at the pump. And so a whole lot of our cost today is taxes, all through it. And so it was hourly wage back when I was first started to work was 25 cents an hour. If you could work 40 hours a week without an interruption, you could make $40 a week. And that $40 would buy a whole lot more than $40 would today. And so the first job I ever had was 25 cents an hour. I've got part of the comments on mill houses, but Mike can do a better job than I can on that. The only thing I wanted to bring up is the mill houses were owned by the mill, and they paid 25 cents per room per week, and plus electricity. And the electricity had meters, and they read them once a month, and that was billed to them whatever it cost. But the mill didn't make any money on it. It was billed out just like they had bought it from Duke Power. When I was very young, there was more horses and wagons in town than there was automobiles on a Saturday morning. And there had been 3 livery stables in Marshal at one time, and one was on Main Street, up where Trackside used to be on Main Street, and that was the one I don't remember at all. One was across from where the Chevrolet place was, and that I remember they had it all boarded up, and in the basement they had every type of horse-drawn conveyance you can think of. The 2-seated job with the fringe on top, and the buggies, and had a hearse in there, and at some point that caught on fire and burned all those things. They'd be very valuable if they were around today. The people out in the country, when they come to town to shop on Saturdays, rode the train. And from Mazeppa, out where Trippett Church is, that was called Mazeppa, it cost 5 cents to ride the train from Mazeppa to Marshal, and 5 cents back. And my mother and dad lived out very near there when they first got married, and they came to town by train. And at that time the tracks went all the way north to Statesville, and then it went back toward Winston-Salem, and that of course went south too. But there was a lot of people who rode the train at that time, and all the mail moved by rail, and they didn't have all those breakdown systems they've got today, and mail moved as fast then as it does today, and the sorting of the mail and the direction it's going to go was done on rail cars. And of course the volume that exists today, they couldn't hardly do what's today what they used to do, but mail was handled a whole lot different. And post office didn't have unions, and you get them to do just about anything. I had an experience in Charlotte one time. I had a mail bag, and for Jacksonville mail, it was all marked and everything. It was ready to load on the truck. I took it to the back of the post office, and there was 3 guys sitting up against the wall, and the Jacksonville truck was sitting there. I said, "Would you tag this and put it on the truck?" And they said, "That's not my job." And I had to wait about a half hour till somebody came out to go back and get somebody. It was their job to take that bag and throw it on the truck. I don't think that's a whole lot of what's wrong with the post office today. Banking was a whole lot different back then than it is today. Banks were privately owned. We had 2 here in Marshal, First National Bank and the Merchant and Farmers. And when the Depression came, the First National survived, Merchant and Farmers did not. And the people who had money invested in Merchant and Farmers lost most of it. And see, back then, you knew who your banker was. If you wanted to buy an automobile, you just call your banker and tell him, "I want to buy this car." How much is it? Oh, that's $25,000. So we'll just write a check for it and come in the next few days and we'll make up a note. Those days are gone. Yeah. So banking is a lot different then. I was in the service and had spinal meningitis and was not expected to live, and the Red Cross notified my dad that I might not recover, and it was on a Sunday. And he called up the bank, and the bank told him he'd meet him at the bank and give him the money to go. And so Dad went to the bank, he opened the vault, gave him the money he needed to go to Mississippi. And of course they can't open the vault now, that's time ball. The way people bought milk was different back then. Milk was delivered to your door. If you wanted 3 quarts of milk a day, the truck would come around early morning and put 3 quarts and pick up those empty bottles. And the driver of the truck would as it approached the house, someone would jump off and take the milk and put it on the door and meet the truck as it progressed. I worked on a milk truck one summer, and I missed the running board and went under the truck, and it ran over my leg. And it was soft sand, so it didn't hurt it to mount anything. But the Edmondsons was a Pet was one. Those were the 2 major ones. But they were the big dairies in Mooresville, and that's the way people bought milk back then. It was delivered to your door.
And if you wanted it different that day, you put a note down in the bottle.
Yes. But if you want a quart of chocolate milk today.
Yeah.
The roads around here were a lot different when I was young. The Perth Church Road from Statesville down was all dirt. And when Henry and Clarence, Cornelius' father, came down the Perth Church Road to where my mother lived on the Langston Highway, she said the white matched horses had been in mud, that the underside, the bellies were red with mud, and the buggy was mud up to the axle. And he announced the birth of Preston Cornelius' father and his uncle, the twins. But that was Perth Church Road. The road from here to Salisbury, as soon as you got hit the Iowa County line, we go in, it was an macadam road, 1 lane to Salisbury. And as you approach Salisbury on the right-hand side, there's a curve in the road, and there's one section of that road that still exists. It goes up to a house. And it tells you that's what the road looked like. And we had an uncle that lived halfway to Salisbury, and we went out there a lot. That's how I remember the Cadam Road. I think our city employees were a whole lot more responsible to the citizens than what they try. Of course, they do a wonderful job today, but we had I think his name was Cook, Mr. Cook. I even know where he lived. He lived on Academy Street. But if we had a heavy snow, he'd get his horse out and drag the sidewalks, and so he could walk to school without having to walk through the snow. And all the main sidewalks in Mooresville, he'd run that drag over them, and on Main Street and the main streets, and with that horse-drawn plow. And it's I don't think anybody would do that today. We had a swimming pool, a Stewart swimming pool. The swimming pool was on the corner of Oak Street and what is now Highway 801. And it's now, I've been told, it's the basement of that house that sits on that location. So the swimming pool was gone, but it's the basement. And the Stewart family had a 2-section tennis court, and it was a really regulation type tennis court. Dirt, the sand, it was the best, and they kept it perfect. Played tennis there a lot of times. And one of my partners was Pete Ferguson, that lived not far away. And we played one afternoon, and Pete put me on his handlebars and took me home, and on his way back he got run over and killed by drunk drivers. So drunk drivers have been around a long time too. There was a 3-story hotel in the middle of town at one time, long gone, and they took the top story off at some point, I don't know what, but all the drummers or salesmen came to town by rail, and that's where they stayed. And that the house next door that's not there now belonged to the school teacher, McNeely, and that's where she lived by herself for many years. But that hotel was a landmark that goes way back to early Mooresville.
It had a wonderful restaurant and run by Mrs. Flowers.
Yes, that's right. That was the lady that ran it for years and years. And the police force of Mooresville consists of one person. And we didn't, of course, the population of Mooresville would have probably been under 5,000. But if anything happened bad, he knew where the bad people were. He'd just go get them. And he was on call 24 hours a day. His last duty of the day was to go around and check all the stores, be sure they was locked, and then he'd go home. And I had a joke with some of the police officers here that when I was little, there was one police officer for the whole town. The last time I knew, there was 56. Is crime 56 times worse now than it was then? I don't think so. But of course, there's a whole lot different need to police. The first hospital in Mooresville was over on Center Avenue, and Dr. McClellan and Dr. Taylor were the two primary doctors there. We had some other doctors, Dr. Bell and Templeton, but the mainstay was Taylor and McClellan, and they together helped build the first modern hospital up on what was then called Eastern Heights. I don't know what they call it now, but it's now county and city offices. But I watched that building being built, and that whole block was just one muddy field. They didn't plow it, didn't farm it. It was just a muddy field. And when they dug the basement for it, they got the drag line down. They finished digging it. They couldn't get the drag line back out, so they had to get a bulldozer to make a ramp and get the drag line back out. And that became the hospital. And my dad was the only elevator repairman that was not, that if you had an elevator problem, you had to call Charlotte, or if you knew Dad, you'd get him to come and fix it. Well, he serviced the elevator for all the years that I could remember, and in return, we didn't get any doctor bills and we didn't get any hospital bills. And that worked out real good. Of course, that was the time when money was kind of scarce. But Dad maintained the elevator, and I spent a lot of time down in the hole in the bottom of that thing cleaning equipment to make that thing run and greasing the cables. The hospital trained nurses, and they train nurses different than they do now. Instead of going to college, they went to a hospital, and hospital they worked pretty much is what we'd call orderlies today during the day, and they went to school at night. And I think the system produced better nurses than they do today, because they work with patients from day one. The nurses' home was right across the street, and so growing up we knew a lot of the nurses real well.
Especially you.
And especially me, yeah, all right. But I think all the ones that I knew are no longer with us. But all of them served in services that I knew in the Navy or the Army during the war. And during the Depression, we had riots all over. When the mills closed, people wanted to go in and work, so they'd storm the mills. And in Kannapolis and Gastonia, the National Guard set up machine guns. I saw them in Kannapolis. They had machine guns set up on top of the building to keep people from coming in and tearing up anything. And Mooresville never had that kind of problem. And when Mooresville Mill closed for a while, my dad, I think, was the only employee. They wanted to be sure the generator worked, and so there'd been somebody firing the generator, the boilers, but Dad was a watchman, and so he borrowed a .32 pistol from my Aunt Mamie, and he never owned a pistol in his life, and he was a night watchman. He'd go around and was with the meter and where you checking the
All
wall.
that was to be done. He done it.
Yeah, but we didn't have riots in Mooresville. We had 3 drugstores in Mooresville back when I was young, just 3. Goodman's, it was on the corner of Main and Center? Yeah, Main and Center, and the Miller's was up at about across the street from the hotel, and then there was one on up in the next block across from where Belk's used to be. And we knew the pharmacists real well, and we were real pleased with the drugstores at the time, but they were drugstores at that time. They didn't get into all other things like they do today. Somewhere along the road, I picked up information that these railroad tracks that run through Mooresville, they've hired slave labor. They solicited slave labor. It was in the Mooresville paper. They wanted slave labor to take the tracks up, to take them up to Richmond area for Lee's supply line. And it was several years before Mooresville got its railroad track back. At one time, the Mooresville City Hall, Police Department, Volunteer Fire Department was all located in one small building, and it was on Broad Street, and the whole building is not there today. But City Hall, all 3 were in one place, in the one fire truck, and the fire trucks, I think that's the same fire truck that's in the museum. That's where it used to be housed, on Broad Street. And during probation, we saw some bootleggers from time to time. And this was the main route from the Wilkes County source of origin to Charlotte. In the wee morning hours, those supercharged cars came rolling through Mooresville. And the only way they could catch them is somebody call ahead and block the road. And they did that one day, and they had the car downtown. I got to see it. It was a supercharged 1932 Model B Ford. The B Ford had a V8 engine in it. That was the first V8 was the Model B Ford, and that was the first supercharger I ever saw, and that was a big thing sitting up on top of the engine, and it would do over 100 miles an hour, so the man said. But a lot of the booze used to go through Mooresville. When I was young, there was only 2 automobile dealers still in Mooresville. There had been others, but Mooresville Ford that Thad Lowe owned, and Fred Morrow that had the Chevrolet place. So if you wanted to buy one or the other, that's where you went. And they were both, the Chevrolet place finally was sold to an out-of-state company, and the first thing they did was fire all the management and bring in their own people. And the people came from the north, and they didn't know anybody, and the business went down the drain. And the last we knew of the Chevrolet place was when all the portable parking lots came in and hauled off all automobiles. That was the end of the Chevrolet place. And Thad Lowe sold to Grady Shoe, and Grady operated it successfully for years and years, and later sold it to a company that owns 37 Ford places. But his son runs it. Grady's no longer with us. We miss him. And I don't think there were 2 barbershops in Mooresville. There was Deluxe Barbershop, that's the one Dad always took us to. And there was Howard and Baxter, which was up the street. And the barbershops also had another service they provided. The country people that didn't have utilities in the house would come in on Saturday and take a bath. So the barbershop had facilities for them to take a bath. And so you could get a haircut for 25 cents, a haircut and a shave for 35 cents, and if you want to take a bath, that was another quarter. And so, but both of them had the facilities to give people a bath, and they had their own hot water heaters that were wood fired, and they kept good hot water ready for people to take a bath. I remember the last big flood that we had at the Catawba River. We had between here and Lincoln was what is called an overhead bridge, all the steel's up above, and the water was so high that the water was running about a foot across the top of the bridge, and debris from barns and stuff was floating down, and I saw a dead cow come down the road, through the water, and nobody would drive across. And one fellow said he was going home, and he drove across that bridge with that foot of water, and nobody else did that day. There was just one fellow had nerve enough to drive across that bridge with the water running across it.
Saw a couple back houses going down there too.
Yeah, oh yeah, and that was when the mill at East Mondo washed away, and the only things left up there today is several of the mill houses are still there, but there's nothing to indicate that there was a mill ever located there. There was once no Lake Norman. That was the Catawba River, and Duke Power started in the early 30s buying up land. They'd go around and tell the farmers, we'll give you this small amount of money, several dollars an acre, and you can live on it as long as you live. And a lot of the farmers did just that, including some people that I knew very well. But Duke Power bought that land very, very cheap, and I don't know how they handled capital gains back then, but But that became a Crescent Land and Developer or something like that. And back in the 30s, late 30s, you could drive to Lincoln or Salisbury in the afternoon and not see a car. People just had no reason to go, I guess, but I did that a number of times. And 801 did not exist. It was built by the WPA, the Workmen's, whatever it was. And they built it mostly by hand with horses, drag pans, no bulldozers, dynamite. They cut the trees and blow them with dynamite, and I watched them do that. But I think most of 801 was built by manual labor the hard way. And if you wanted to go out to Triplet Church, you went past the Cascade Mill and out and across the overhead bridge, and then turned back to the right. And where you turned to the right, the road back to the left, coming back toward Mooresville, didn't exist. That road was not there. But that's how you got to Mazeppa. You went across that overhead bridge. The original Baptist church was a wood building, and that was the biggest fire that I had ever seen up to that time. It burned well, and Mooresville Mills had power lines that went from the mill up to the number 1 mill that ran along the street, and the wires were catching on fire, and that's how my dad was involved. But the poles were not wood at that time. They were metal poles, three-pronged metal poles, but the wires were on fire. And I was across the street when the bell fell, and the bell fell. That was the loudest noise that you can imagine. And I don't know whether that bell's still in use today or not.
It probably is.
But that was a big fire. As you go up Main Street today, that shopping center that's up on North Main was not there. The first thing was a little store, and then the McNeely house, and then there was 2 other houses there. And when I first came out of the service, they had already decided to make that a shopping center, and the McNeelys had moved, and the house was empty. So I got that as a temporary residence till I got a house built. And the house was well built. It was an excellent house. I never did understand why somebody didn't move it instead of tearing it down, but they bulldozed it. And at one time we had an airplane crash out of 801. Biplane. He tried to had engine trouble, I guess, but he tried to land and he ran out of runway and ran in a ditch and was killed. So that was Mooresville's aircraft accident.
Was he not the Mexican that was flying?
You had a piece of canvas at one time.
Yeah, I had a piece of his skull one time too.
Oh, okay.
The airplane flipped over and slid, and it was body parts. And I'm sure he was I think he was a captain, and he was trying to make some kind of a record.
Well, he didn't make it, did he?
He didn't quite make it.
And Mooresville's had its own train wreck. Just south of town, there's a freight that tried to pull over on the side to get out of the way of the express freight, and he had 2 or 3 cars that too long, so it was still on the main track. and the other train hit it, and when it did, it pushed the cab of the first locomotive forward, and the engineer, the brakeman jumped. The engineer was badly burned, scalded, and he died in the hospital. But Mooresville has had a train wreck too. One of the largest construction companies around was Barger's, and Barger's, a lot of the churches in this area were built by Barger's. They built and they renovated houses, and Roy Denny was one of their foremen, and I went with him several times. His son, his first son, we were in the third grade together, and he died from an illness. And then Hugh, his other son, which we became very good friends, got killed during the war. But Roy built a lot of the churches around, and Barger's was a big company at that time. They also built post offices. I was a casualty representative in the Air Force, and I went in a post office site up in Virginia, and the fellow in charge of it was Vance Brown with Barger's, Mooresville. And so they did reach out pretty far. They also built part of Miller Beach Air Force Base. I was down there with them when they were working on that, and there's a P-40 tried to land there, and it wasn't finished, and he ran into an embankment, and Hugh and I jumped in the truck and raced over to where he was, and he came out of the cockpit with a lot of profanity about what a lousy runway that was. Prior to the 1930s, we didn't have Social Security. When people got old, their family took care of them, or if they had no family, they went to the county home. And I think every county in North Carolina had a county home. Mooresville, or all the counties, was up at Troutman, and my uncle ran it at one time, and it was a working place. It was a working farm. They had milk cows, they raised hogs, truck farm, and anybody who could worked. And the ones that they helped the ones that couldn't work, and so it was I think a lot better system than this warehousing we have today. And I believe there's 3 counties in North Carolina that still have county homes. I don't know what 3, but I've been told that there's still 3. But it was that property is still county owned, I think. But there was one fellow in a trailer up there, and they fed him his food with a tray, and I think he had leprosy. Didn't nobody want to have anything to do with him. But anyway, my uncle ran that place for a number of years. Mooresville Telephone Company. It started early. By 1916, my mother and my father were working there. My mother was a telephone operator, and my father was a linesman. And the lines it was very small, and they didn't have a lot of rural line. And the line, one of the lines ran out to Mazeppa, and Dad's mother lived some distance from there, and so he had to get the property owners to allow him to put up the poles and run the line from Mazeppa down to the house, which is, what, about a mile. And you had to buy your own telephone, and it was a crank type, and that type telephone used one wire, and the other wire went in the ground, to a ground stake. And if you got where you couldn't get real good reception, maybe your stake wasn't deep enough, you'd go out and pour water around the stake, and the telephone would work a whole lot better. There was a lot of gold in North Carolina at one time. There's a line, if you run a line from Dahlonega, Georgia, across Gold Hill, North Carolina, on over east to this side of Carthage, there was gold mines all along that line. And the one south of Salisbury, which is Gold Hill, was the last one in this area that was mined. And I talked to one of the miners years ago, and he said the only reason they closed that mine is they couldn't pump the water out fast enough. And so maybe there's still gold over there. And one of the things of recreation was Brown swimming pool. And Brown swimming pool started sometime, probably the latter part of the last century, not the 19th century, not the 20th, the early 20th century. And it had plank sides, and a stream fed it, and later they put concrete sides in and built a dance hall. And back in the 20s, that dance hall was a real popular place. And so the dance hall closed, and it was an empty building. And Frank Brown, who owned it at that time, put in a good maple floor, and it became a skating rink. And it was a skating rink for many years, right on up into World War II. And the swimming pool is, I don't know how long it's been closed now, but it's been closed a long time.
Yes, it has been.
But it went back to a recreation place for
People came from all around to skate here.
back my mother and dad's time, where the dance hall. Mail, I hit on a little bit, but a little bit more. Mail was handled a whole lot locally different than it is today. Didn't have all those little cars running around. They walked, and a carrier had to carry 75 pounds to qualify to be a carrier. Well, that rule changed when they had to allow the ladies to be carriers, but it's a whole lot different than it is today. Didn't have zip codes.
Most of the mail we got back then, a lot of it just had Dad's name, Marshal, North Carolina.
That's all. Yeah. And we had a bowling alley at one time, right on the Salisbury Highway. It was quite popular.
So like them.
Cemetery at Triplet Church started in an unusual way. The Cohen, J. Will Cohen, was in the Philippine Islands in 1903, and he died there on Corregidor. And he sent his body home. Well, of course, it was delivered by rail. It was on a weekday. Well, when they got to Mazeppa, there was a train stop. There was no one there. So the engineer and the conductor and probably one or two others carried the body up and set it up beside the church. And so sometime later, I don't know how long it was later, some of the church people found it out, and that became the first body that was buried in that cemetery. And there is now 5 generations of my family in that cemetery. But that was the first one. Now I'll let you have a meal.
Well, I tell you, something good. Well, let's take this too.